Well, we are live.
Let me see.
And I'd invite everyone to mute themselves if they are not speaking, just to keep things quiet. We're anticipating we'll have a few more folks joining here. I'm going to make Pastor Jonathan another co-host too, so he can help navigate any technical things. So good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Dustin Wright, who, at least we haven't officially said it yet, but I guess I'm the senior pastor of Messiah Lutheran Church. It's great to have you here for our forum on One Messiah. We wanted to, ahead of our annual meeting on February 7th, we wanted to provide an opportunity for everyone in our congregation and in our wider community to hear what we've been working on over this last year in terms of our unification with Trinity Reformed Church right down the street, our wonderful neighbors. And also to just cast some idea about where we are moving forward, and also an opportunity to ask whatever questions we might have. We don't have every single answer to everything yet, but we will try to illuminate this for folks as much as we can. Just so you know, this is recorded and is live, and folks will be watching as well, and this will be a resource for people who can't make it live. So if you do not want to appear live, you can simply turn your video off, and that should make it so that you know your face won't be seen. So here's the I'll sort of just go through what the shape of our evening will look like, and then I'll start. So I'm just going to provide a very brief opening reflection. And then I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Jonathan, our interim associate pastor and the now former pastor of Trinity Reformed Church, to talk a little bit about how his community got to where we are today. I'll provide that similar story from Messiah's perspective. Then we're going to go through what our current proposal is for the redevelopment of Trinity site. Then Pete Jones, our president, is going to talk about some of the, why he thinks that this is a good idea moving forward from a sort of a missional perspective of service to our neighbors. And then Neil Fisher is going to talk about sort of these things from the financial perspective. And then I'm going to turn it over to the Reverend Peter Cook from the New York State Council of Churches to talk a little bit about some of the next steps that are before us. So with that said, I just want to briefly, and I thought it was very pertinent for today, read from our Bread for the Day daily devotional. People were bringing even infants to Jesus that he might touch them. And when the disciples saw it, they sternly ordered them not to do it. But Jesus called for them and said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter into it." So friends, a year ago, almost exactly, we were gathered here, and I thought that we would be soon voting on moving forward with a capital campaign that we had been talking about for a couple of years to make our building accessible and to expand our food pantry. And of course, that's when that morning we found out that the cost of what we were going to be proposing was double what it was expected to be. And that was a heartbreaking thing. I don't think I've ever had a more difficult night in terms of, my professional life, having to come to that meeting and to say to people, I don't think we should go forward with this plan. And since then, I really deeply do believe that God has moved forward in some really, and has called us forward in some really extraordinary ways to not just help us become an fully accessible community, but to really, I think, provide a roadmap for what it might look like to be, a thriving faith community in the 21st century. All across the country, there are small congregations of similar denominations that aren't working together to better their community. And we have that opportunity, I believe, to do that right now as one Messiah Lutheran Church. And to not just do that for ourselves, but right as our today's Bible verse talks about, especially as we're trying to rebuild after such a horrific year, after we have all lost so much, to create something, to tell a different story, to inspire, our young people as well, to say that we can work together. We can build a better world. We can get the world to somewhat, just a little bit closer to what Jesus called the kingdom of God. And so that's why I'm just so excited you are all here with us tonight. I'll just open us with this brief prayer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Jonathan to tell a little bit about Trinity's side of the story. Let us pray. Eternal Father, you sent your Son to reveal the boundless nature of your love. Forgive us when we put limits on your love. Teach us to embody the grace you give freely. Equip us to love like Jesus. Amen. All right, and with that said, I'm going to remove the spotlight from me, and I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Jonathan to talk a little bit about Trinity side of the story and how they got here.
Great, perfect. Well, thanks everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Pastor Jonathan. I, up until January 1, was the minister at Trinity Reformed Church, right up the road from Messiah, and just wanted to kind of give everyone an overview as to how this wild plan all came to be. So I came to Trinity Reformed Church back in 2016 in an interim capacity. At that point, Trinity's minister before me, Art Hudak, who had been there for 7 years, had just retired, and Trinity was discerning what was next for its future. Despite kind of its best efforts, Trinity was experiencing a decline similar to most churches in our area. And we're faced with many of the same challenges: an aging congregation, a declining source of revenue, and just, kind of a lack of, certainty about what the future might hold. When I came on into that position, the position for me was funded for the first year by another church in our denomination, the First Reformed Church of Schenectady down in the Stockade. And that year really gave our community time to discern what was important to us, to help Trinity kind of develop a missional identity and to think about, what might it look like for its future. Really early on in that process, I was clear with Trinity that there were no guarantees. There was no guarantee that any plan would necessarily create enough revenue to help Trinity move forward. And I invited them to think boldly, to think about, if money was not a constraint, what would you want Trinity's legacy to be in the community? After that first year, I had Trinity apply for a grant from our denomination. They received a $40,000 grant over 3 years, which essentially would continue to fund my salary for 3 years. It also provided Trinity with some additional funding to essentially play money, where Trinity was encouraged to use that in new and creative ways to think missionally as to its purpose in the Rotterdam community. Because one of the realities that churches often face is when they are in decline, the first things to go are outreach programs. While those decisions might help a church continue to survive kind of in an insular fashion, when you cut off outreach and kind of community activities, you essentially cut off any ties that you might have to continue to grow and develop as a congregation. So doing that is often seen as a stopgap. In giving Trinity an ability to think missionally without constraints about money, it allowed them to really be creative and to help them decide what sort of future that they wanted to leave. Again, this grant was not designed to continue Trinity's legacy artificially, but rather to help them become honest about where they were. Over the next 3 years, Trinity went through an ongoing kind of discernment process about its identity. After a year in the process, Trinity went through a discernment period in which they voted to become a welcoming, affirming, and celebrating church of LGBTQ people. Only the second Reformed church in the Schenectady area to do that. First Reformed Church of Schenectady was the first. At the same time, thinking missionally about what it would mean to provide more outreach, Trinity looked at what it had done in the past and what it was already doing. The previous minister, Art Hudak, who was there before me, had left a great legacy with starting a recovery program, which had at that point grown to 5 AA and Al-Anon meetings that meet in the church on a weekly basis. That was one of the things that Trinity, in kind of discerning what its future might look like, really kind of took for granted. As we started to, ask around to other churches and tell them about our own missional identity, we realized churches actually choosing to invite AA groups in is actually something that doesn't happen as often as people think it does. There's a lot of liability that a church takes on with something like that, and that really kind of reflected Trinity's willingness to serve people in our community. In fact, a number of more recent members of our community joined Trinity Church as a result of those AA and Al-Anon programs. Additionally, Trinity began to explore issues around food insecurity and food justice. During my time at Trinity, I served on the board of Patty's Place. Patty's Place is a program that's an offshoot of the YWCA and of SICM that provides resources and referrals to sex workers in Schenectady. It ran on a no questions asked policy where individuals could come and receive toiletry supplies and also receive referral letters for agencies if they did need that. Trinity wanted to model its feeding program kind of on a same pattern where individuals would be able to come and receive food without any questions being asked. One of the things that we had done in our research as part of our discernment process was to realize that while Schenectady had a number of food pantries and food banks available, very few did not have barriers that would have discriminated against the sex workers that we served at Patty's Place. Trinity realized we wanted to be able to provide food for those most on the margins who wouldn't be able to access food in these other pantries and other spaces. All through this time, Trinity, increasingly turned its focus outward. I think one of the best ways to document this would be the fact that over those 3 years of the grant process, Trinity's budget declined every year. The one place, however, that our budget did increase was budgeted amounts for our food pantry outreach. I like to say that a budget is a moral document. It shows what the values and morals of an institution are. And the fact remains that despite the fact that Trinity knew it probably was pushing towards kind of financial insolvency at a faster pace, they realized that it was still more important to feed people. Even if it meant that our own worshiping community might reach its end a little bit sooner. So starting back in 2019, Trinity, as we reached the end of our grant process, began to consider who we might explore partnerships with. We initially explored a partnership with Cobblestone Reformed Church, which is off of Putnam Avenue. Those conversations were preliminary. They were without a minister at the time, but they ended up calling a minister. And they hold some different values. They're not a welcoming community to LGBTQ people, so that eventually became a non-starter for us. As we continued in our discernment process, I was working with Pastor Dustin at the time with SICM, with their process to become an interfaith organization. So Pastor Dustin and I got to know each other better through that process. We already knew each other through our work through Schenectady Clergy Against Hate. But in our conversations, we began to realize that both of our churches were thinking about, kind of the next steps that we were being led towards through kind of a wild series of events. We began to realize that God was indeed calling our two congregations to work more closely together. Over this past year, and even before this past year, with all the wildness of COVID, we began to worship together. We began to spend time together. We began to have listening sessions together. In fact, the first time that folks from Messiah and Trinity worshiped together in Trinity space was a year ago last Sunday, on the Sunday of Christian Unity, in which we held a listening session afterwards to begin to dream together. Never in my wildest dreams did I think we'd be at the space that we are today. We are excited about what is to come. We recognized right at the end of this grant process that we had applied for 3 years prior, the conclusion of the grant was that Trinity either was going to close or was going to realize new life. And we have come to the awareness that Trinity is in fact realizing new life in a partnership with Messiah Lutheran Church. So after many discussions and listening groups as best we could over COVID, we came to the realization that Trinity's life as an independent congregation was over. It no longer could financially support itself. We kind of ran our budget pretty dry. And we realized that it was time for our congregations to come together. And we also believe that if we can do this in the midst of a global pandemic, then that speaks to the strength of what God is doing in our midst. If we can overcome something like this, we can overcome any of the hurdles that will be coming our way. So I'm excited about this process. Part of my work in our denomination, I'm in the Reformed Church, will be releasing Trinity's property over to Messiah Lutheran Church. And that's a process that requires a little bit of hoop jumping, but because of the place that I occupy in our denomination right now, again, kind of for such a time as this, we'll be able to effect those transfers hopefully as smoothly as possible, and hopefully have all the property and assets consolidated under Messiah, hopefully by this spring, to continue our work in merging and sharing in our resources and mission together as one church under Messiah. I will be continuing at Messiah for at least to the end of November. It's a one-year term appointment as an interim associate minister to help with that transition and to help our congregations come together in this unprecedented time. And it's something that I'm really enjoying, coming alongside the folks from Messiah and bringing our folks from Trinity alongside as well. So it's been an exciting journey, and we are excited to see what's next.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pastor Jonathan, and we are very happy to have you here come alongside us as well. Most of the folks here are, members of Messiah, so I don't really need to go into that much detailed history. You know it in some ways probably better than I. But my gosh, I couldn't imagine when I first got Messiah's paperwork fresh out of, or really I was still at seminary, a little over 7 years ago now, that we would be where we are today. Right, as I understand it, I know a number of people were part of that call process. Rich was the council president at the time, who was on our call today, and it seems like, as far as I can tell, kind of before I got here, the people of Messiah Lutheran Church decided they had gone through a lot of difficult times as well, and they decided they wanted to make things work. And we've significantly grown by every type of measure over the last few years. I think one of our biggest things that I'm the proudest of is similarly to what Pastor Jonathan was talking about with Trinity Reformed, is that we decided, I believe it was in 2018, to become a reconciling in Christ congregation as well. And we have just grown that much more since then. And similarly too, we, I think, gosh, it was probably my first few months here that I had gotten a message from the folks over at Schenectady Community Ministries that they were going to do a tour of a number of these kind of innovative food pantries in New Jersey. And I said, oh, I'll go on the free ride, sure, but I need to bring some people with me. And so I believe it was Judy and Jill and our beloved and recently lost her, Nancy Stelrick, who joined us. And that inspired us to get a food pantry going here at Messiah too. And it's been more important than ever. I mean, just to give you an idea, and thank you, Judy, for getting in your annual report stuff on time. But right, so last year, our food pantry had 864 guests. In 2019, 2020, 1,200 265 guests. So a very, 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 very significant increase. 2019, there was a 7,911 meals served. This 2020, 11,330, 385 meals served. So massive increase in service to the community. A couple of years ago, in some ways, I think, related to our sense of wanting to be welcoming to everyone, our welcoming process, that we decided that we really need to figure out a way to become a fully accessible building. We had a couple of different sort of master plan ideas. We contracted with a local architect to come up with a couple different ideas. And then we got to right around the point last year, that I mentioned earlier, where we were going to sort of have the version of this meeting a year ago, and it turned out that morning that the cost was double what we expected. And God works in some pretty wild ways. Literally that day, I had already had a meeting set with Pastor Jonathan to talk about some of those sick interfaith things. And Pastor Jonathan is also a therapist. And so when I came to his office that morning, I was like, dude, I need a therapist for a few minutes, big time. And so we started talking, and we realized how much, how there might be some symbiosis there. And then I think actually it was later that day that I bumped into Reverend Peter Cook at a meeting as well. And, he realized that this "who is my neighbor" process might be something that we would want to engage in. And that's what we've spent the last year doing. We got slowed down by a month or two right after COVID, but the congregation voted to appoint Joyce Gresham and Neil Fisher and Charlie Zitzman to a group, and Pete Jones, as our president, has joined it as well, along with Lori Lumbra and Adrian Westfeld from Trinity Reformed, to a group to work with a group of lawyers and architects and Peter Cook himself to figure out a way to redevelop Trinity's property into a center of community here in Rotterdam, and in a way that serves the community in a way that likely provides affordable housing as well, and also will in some way help generate some of the revenue to make our building fully accessible as well. And so there's been a whole lot of stuff, whole lot of meetings, way too many calls with lawyers. They're great lawyers though, and that's where we are today. So a few things that have already happened, just that the council has been able to take action on is right as of, I think, technically December 31st at 11:59 p.m. All of Trinity's members are now members of Messiah Lutheran Church. As of December 26th, we have hired Pastor Jonathan. He was our interim minister of music, but now he's our interim associate pastor. We have Dave Kartner as our new parish caretaker, and then Sarah Bacharek is going to be helping us in a limited way as a sort of a part-time administrative assistant. So those things have already transpired, and now we're journeying towards the next big date, which is our annual meeting on February 7th, where we'll need to vote on things like deciding to take property or take title of Trinity's property. We do not currently own that property yet. That still is in the hands of the Schenectady classis. We will need to slightly amend our bylaws to make it so that for a few years there's a former member of Trinity Reformed on our council, and a number of other similarly actions. So anyway, we got through this whole process, and I will show you kind of where we are today. Let me share my screen and make sure. There we go. So this, as you can see, this is a 57-page long PDF. And if you want all 57 pages, by all means, let me know. But it's a lot of stuff that it's hard to wrap your head around. But, so the "who is my neighbor" process, and Peter can talk more about it in a second, but is a process with consultants, with lawyers, with architects, with community sort of development experts, where they look at everything from zoning and property location, and a bunch of other factors, and come up with a proposal about how you can redevelop your church property in a way that serves the community and helps generate revenue for the ongoing operations of the congregation. And so this is a bird's eye view of Trinity's property. As you can see here, it's uniquely situated, obviously right towards Five Corners, right by the Boys and Girls Club of Rotterdam, also near all these ball fields. So it really became, and also the zoning is preferable. So it quickly became apparent in our throughout these meetings that it made sense for Messiah's current building to remain our center of worship and faith formation and fellowship and all, I guess, some of those typical church-y things, but that it would make sense for Trinity's property to become our community center, and to do so in a way that doesn't just utilizes the current building, but also adds on a wide variety of features. This is a rough draft. Peter will go through how this document might be refined later on. But so let's see here. This is all about zoning overlays. I learned way more about that than I ever wanted to over the last year. But this is a current drawing of Trinity's existing facility, right? So there's the existing church. There's parking here, and then there's a small garage. There's a sort of a grassy area back here. Then here are the ball fields. Here are the Boys and Girls Club. And this is roughly what our consultants are proposing. This is rough. We can put lots of input into this. As we find a developer, they'll have input for this. But the general idea, right, is that we would retain either ownership or control in one way or the other over Trinity's existing building, and it would be could be everything from space for mental health care workers, perhaps, or for our 12-step programs, art space, all sorts of co-working space, a wide variety of options. A number of townhomes and workforce housing options would be here, and perhaps a community garden. There would be some parking here and shared with the ball fields as well. And then, at least as of this thing, but once again, this can change. There's a lot that needs to be decided. The initial drawing had put this community market food bank piece here. But we can put that in where we want. So to give you a 3D version of what that looks like, this is the current property, with the Boys and Girls Club over here, and what it would look like proposed is there. So once again, it would really become a central hub of Rotterdam, New York, and a community that really has not seen the type of investment it needs. So there's the front version. And so as you can see, this is where it might develop. So that's the initial idea, and I can pull those graphics back up and ask any more questions. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our president, Pete Jones, to talk about, from him, to someone that's been very involved in a wide variety of community organizations, about his perspective as, and I know he's spoken with Joyce as well, about sort of the missional side of why this seems to be a good idea. You're muted.
I know. I was trying to get it. It wouldn't go. Okay, so Pastor has said some of what I have written here, but I'm going to say it all anyway. So a lot of what we do over there depends on the COVID-19 pandemic. But hopefully the Trinity campus will become our Bread of Life community center. And we hope to utilize the property to serve the needs of our neighbors and of our community. Now, as Pastor said, AA or Pastor Jonathan said this, AA and Al-Anon have been meeting there. I don't know if they're still meeting, but they have been there for a while. And as I understand it, their food pantry, although a lot of it will go over to the Messiah campus, they will still be giving out produce in their drive-through process, no questions asked. So That's a good thing. The Who is My Neighbor project, as Pastor mentioned, talked about affordable housing apartments. I don't know if you noticed, but in the middle of that drawing was a community garden, which could either perhaps the people who lived in those housing apartments could utilize that, or we could have fresh produce at the food pantry like we did this past summer at Messiah, with gardens all over the property. I never saw so many cucumbers, I have to say that. There's also the opportunity to open it up to other organizations, groups, or individuals to either rent out or utilize. I can tell you, having been on the boards of several organizations that don't have physical buildings, like Concern for the Hungry, there's no physical building. And so periodically they're looking for a place to hold board meetings. And so that could be something you could do with this. It wouldn't be a permanent fixture there, but once a month they could meet over there. As Pastor said, on February 4th, he'll be meeting with Carrie Dunn Herrera from the county to give her a tour of Trinity, and hopefully Trinity will become a vaccination site. I would like that. My vaccination is not until April 3rd, so maybe I could get in earlier. That would be really nice. We've talked about other potentials like having art space, mental health counseling. Our strategic plan outlines some ideas like educating the public about about climate change. Adult education topics. Right now we have a really good adult education going on. Maybe we could hold it over there and invite the public. And the possibilities are really endless, and suggestions are always welcome and encouraged. So, of course, none of this is set in stone, and it requires passing by the council and eventual passing by the congregation. So that's what I have to say.
So I am not seeing Neil on here. Unless I'm missing?
Nope, I didn't see him either.
So I will text him in a second. I don't know if he didn't have the link or what, or he might have texted me. I gotta find it. But we will, sort it out. But so I guess at this point, it might make sense to turn it over to Peter Cook to talk about sort of where we are in this process, and where we will be going, depending on how we vote on February 7th. So I'll turn it over to Peter Cook to talk a little bit about the process.
Great. Thank you so much, Dustin and Jonathan and Pete. And it's just really inspiring for me to just listen to this story and how I think you've come to this place the right way. Really, and taking these challenges and turning them into real opportunities. So you really are, all of you, both of your congregations are to be commended for your tenacity and your courage and your faithfulness. I think what I'm going to try to do is just lay out a little bit of what you can see, what will happen next, where you are and where you're going. So what's happening here is a meeting with the congregation, kind of lay out this information of where you've been, and you're not voting on anything today, but for you to really understand, where you are, where you're headed. So we talk about 5 stages of pre-development. This is the process that churches use to position themselves to use their property in faithful ways. So the first phase of that is something that you have already done. You've had a variety of conversations. You looked at your mission. You have, really done that with some depth, and you've made some positive moves to be able to merge together. And that's what we call phase one. Phase two is where you are now putting together two things. One is you're working on the legal transfers that need to happen so that there's clear site control, in this case, Messiah, and you have an attorney who is executing that, the terms for that transfer of sale. And you're doing a second thing, which is figuring out what you need to do to position that property for you to enter into a partnership with somebody who has the expertise and resources to develop that property for you to take your mission forward. So what you're doing is you are putting together with Goldstein Hall a scope of work which describes here are the things that the church needs to do to find out its potential for the use of this property. It's a more in-depth zoning analysis, environmental study, an appraisal that is in some depth, and it's gathering this information during phase two and then moving to what we call phase three, which is that you are assembling all of this information into something which is called an RFQ or an RFP. This is sort of a proposal that your church puts together, which you use to market to try to attract developers who you would enter into what's called a joint venture agreement. An RFQ means that the developer would do more of the work up front with the expectation that they would likely become the sole development partner, although there is an escape hatch or a guarantee. And an RFP is one where that whole arrangement is buttoned down, but where you might have to do more of the front work. Probably it would be an RFQ. And then phase four is that your congregation would negotiate with the help of an attorney a joint venture agreement with a partner or a developer. And that's a very complex, rock solid legal document that ensures that everybody's interests are protected. And phase five is then the process of gathering the funding and the approvals when you're in a strong relationship with a development partner. So at each step along the way, you've painted sort of a vision of what you could do with that property, but you're going to have to weigh that vision against, what's real in terms of the market and what you can do and what the possibilities are, and that final product isn't really going to, that final design isn't really going to happen until you're in an actual joint venture agreement with a developer. So there's lots of safeguards that protect all the parties along the way in the staging process.
Objective and his commitment is to bring transparency and truth.
Yeah, so I think we might have Neil joining us now. I'm not sure. But thank you, Peter. That's a great overview. I think a few things that are really important to highlight for people is that in all likelihood, we don't know for sure because we can't know for sure until we apply for it. But we will likely be able to receive a $30,000 grant from the New York Attorney General's office to help pay for the vast majority of all this lawyer stuff, pre-development work stuff, and which is certainly a really exciting thing. There will.
Sorry, just to amplify, that was obviously a key point here. To do that collection of data and information requires money, and we want churches to feel confident doing that. And so that's where this grant money comes in from the Attorney General's office. And they're very excited about this project. They're expecting a scope of work and a proposal from you. It all looks very promising, but we have to, lay out those details.
Yeah, thank you. And so now there will be, right, some cost to Messiah. Now, Pastor Jonathan has indicated that the last appraisal of Trinity's property was, or I believe $750,000, right? And so
That's right.
And it'll probably, we don't know, but the part that we would have to kick in would be less than $10,000 in terms of covering, and it might be significantly less. It could be $5,000 in terms of covering the bit that we need from our own legal representation before we take title to the property. And there's a couple other things that if you really want to get into the details of title insurance and environmental assessments, I've been learning way too much about this stuff. But we can certainly, provide as much detail on that stuff as you would like. I don't know. That usually the iPad is Neil Fisher. I don't know if that's Neil Fisher, but it might be. And if it is, if you want to talk about things from a financial perspective, if that's Neil,
It's me.
Yay! All right. Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
Well, from a financial perspective, I think that you have stated it very specifically, and that is we're looking at Messiah having to spend up to $10,000 to cover title insurance, environmental phase 1. I guess building inspection is in that. I'm not exactly sure of that. But I think the only question would be, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for the beginning of this meeting, but I understand this $30,000 grant is looking good, which is great. And it's to cover the creation of this planned community, if you will, on the Trinity property. And I believe it covers all of the basic costs of transferring or not transferring, of Messiah purchasing the Trinity property. Am I correct there?
I'm not completely sure about that. And that would be a good Jason question. It looks as though some of that costs would be covered under that pre-development grant. That grant is to do everything that you need to do to get to the point of getting through negotiating a joint venture agreement with a developer.
Okay.
Okay. Now, it may be that there are some costs outside the 30 that grant will not cover all of it in terms of that acquisition cost. However, you can at the point at which you get into the joint venture agreement, have as a condition of sale or condition of the agreement that some of those costs, if not all of them, are covered farther down the line. And that's a kind of a Jason legal question that that she would really need to ask him about.
Mhm.
The other possibility is that, in terms of fronting some of that money that that you can maybe negotiate that with Trinity in terms of the buyer and seller, if there's any, say, sharing of costs that might go on there. That might be another possibility. So anyway, I do think that clarity you should get from Jason. But I think the worst case scenario is that would be, out of pocket in addition to the grant.
Okay. But my only concern is, what I think we've laid out is Messiah covering up to $10,000 worth, which were outside of Jason's expenses and the architect expenses.
Right.
If there's something else because part of Jason's expenses were basic transfer documentation and what have you of the property. If that's not covered, if that doesn't fall within the grant, then Messiah may have to come up with more money. I'll bet later on it may be refunded, if you will, when a contract is negotiated. But
Yeah.
it's still something that we would have to front in 2021.
Yeah. I don't think that we're talking about more than $10,000.
Okay.
But again, this is where you want to look at the fine print and just be sure.
Yep.
And I think that there's some possibility that some of the 10,000 itself might even be rolled into the AG grant. But again, maybe not. But I think that you're looking at a $10,000 ceiling, which includes the purchase of title insurance.
Okay, that's good. I know
Down
Jason,
the line, some of these costs could be recoverable, and you want to keep clear documentation of what you've spent, because that can become part of the negotiation when you get to a joint venture agreement.
right. Well, I know Jason's letter had laid out how the $30,000 would be allocated for this.
Mhm.
And that, as I understood it, that included the basic purchasing
Yeah.
documentation. I just want to make sure that that would be acceptable to the grant requirements. And
Yeah, I think the AG has more flexibility in
okay,
terms of what they'll cover. I think it's more what costs, I mean, Goldstein Hall, the architects are already discounting what they're doing, and it's
right.
just trying to figure out, what those costs are, and that's all clear, as you go into this process.
Okay.
All right. So at this point, the couple other parts that are very critical about this that to talk about is what's happening to our building, our initial building here at Messiah 2, right? Our worship center, the accessibility piece. And so what is being proposed, right, is that a couple of years down the line, there's in all likelihood, and we will be receiving a fair amount of income from Trinity's building and from that redevelopment site, and it could probably come a couple different ways. But that we wouldn't want all that funding to just go towards our accessibility project, because we also would want that community center to be funded. And thus the other piece of that, of what we're going to be proposing, is that we do probably this fall, and likely with Pete Roos from GSB's help, conduct a capital campaign to once and for all make our building accessible. One possibility that has been sort of floated about, and that has not been, I haven't had a chance to even follow up on yet, is the architects that are already been a part of this Who Is My Neighbor process. They have all our building plans. They've already reviewed it very well. It might behoove us to go back to them and say, what does it mean to, what is the simplest possible way to make this building accessible? And so that's the other part of this timeline of a process. So, it's in all likelihood, right? We could see I think the construction for our for Messiah's Worship Center, in terms of the accessibility, warm weather 2000, let me do the math, probably 2022, or whenever the construction time can start. So that's about the basic structure of where we are. I realize that some people might not want to ask questions in this large public space. And so if you have those private questions, please email me. I can't keep track of lots of texts and phone calls, but email me and I will definitely find the time to work through whatever you have. But I also imagine that many of you probably do have questions that you would want to ask right now. And we have some of the experts on the line with us. I know this is so much to wrap your head around. And we can make all the various letters and a couple of people have already asked for that whole PDF I showed, and I can actually put that whole thing in the chat box and we can link to it too for everyone. But what questions do people have here? Or is your head just spinning like mine is? People watching on Facebook, if you have a question too, feel free to throw it in the chat box. Hearing none, we do have Pete Roos here, and I did not. I'm putting you on the spot, and maybe it would be helpful just to tell everyone a little bit about GSB's process as part of this too, since you're here, and I'm so thankful you're here, Pete, as well.
Sure, no, glad to do it. Yeah, glad to do it. And this has been just so exciting, hearing all the work that you've been doing as a congregation. As I look back at the strategic planning work you did last year, and I know when I met with you last year, we talked about this a little bit, and your values of being welcoming and inviting, and so expanding your building to make that more accessible fits right in there. That you're proactive. Oh my goodness, I work with a lot of congregations around the country. I haven't seen a lot of congregations that are as proactive as your communities have been, really in very prayerfully and thoughtfully moving forward. So I'm just thrilled to be a part of this conversation. Kind of the way the strategic planning process works, before we can really get up and running, it's really important that that your communities do the work of really identifying what is this addition going to look like? What do we need to do? What are the costs? So you kind of the first work is to kind of get that groundwork laid, so that by the time we're entering into a strategic planning process, we're inviting people to be generous, to make this dream possible, this dream of accessibility and welcome and all of that. So by the time we do that, all the ducks are in a row, and we're not raising money hoping that it's going to be enough to do something down the road, but that we're able to say, hey, we got everything lined up and ready to go. The way that we really view a capital campaign like this, it's really, on the one hand, it's about money because we need to raise money, right? But at the other hand, it's not. It's really about helping you to tie in with your goals, with your mission, with your vision, what God is calling you to do. And simply to work through the process to encourage people to be generous to make that happen. And there's one thing that we work very hard with is developing a team in the congregation to really oversee this process. We would involve lots of people in this, so that it's not just one or two people who are trying to drive it, but that we have a wide base of people doing all sorts of different things. I mean, from people in planning and strategic realms to people kind of dropping off packets at people's homes or people making phone calls. So a huge range of people who have the opportunity to get involved, because we know that as people get involved in any process, they get more excited about it. I mean, that's how I am. If I get involved in something, suddenly it's not just the project the church is doing, but it's the project that I'm a part of. And so I get to be a part of that. It's looking like the timeline will probably work out, that this would be able to just be done as part of the annual appeal, so that we have a very robust annual appeal. One thing that we're already in conversation with some of the leaders at Messiah is about having you part of an annual appeal process. Last year you were in a beginning a culture of generosity, which is a small process that we have. This year we're looking to involve you in stewardship for all seasons, which is much more robust. But so that would be around funding the just the annual ministry of Messiah. But so we would bring along this capital piece. So in the midst of, in the fall appeal, we would be talking a lot about what God is doing building wise and what God is doing ministry wise, and it would all come together. And people would be invited to make a commitment, on the one hand to Messiah's ministry for 2022, but on the other hand, for this capital project, and that would likely be a commitment over. And the nice thing about that is, sometimes people get worried that, well, if we have a capital campaign, we're going to have to cut back on our ministry because all the money is going to go into the building, right? But actually, as we've seen in our experience, and when this is done well, actually both go up. And so, so even as you're raising new monies for a building, you're actually able to grow your ministry, because your ministry isn't about your building. Your building is a tool through which you're able to accomplish what God is calling you to be about. And as we've been hearing, you have multiple buildings that now you may be part of that vision. But really tying it into bringing these two pieces together, making sure that the ministry and God's work and the building are all, and your vision are all tied together. And involving lots of people will be, and there's going to be lots of nuance that goes into it. Every congregation's a little bit different. Depending on the dollar amounts that are needed, there's some different tactics we may bring into it. And those are things we can kind of figure out as we get a little bit closer, and as you kind of work to come to some clarity. So as we did kind of a year ago, we can kind of do some of the pre-work to kind of start getting some ducks in a row. But giving you the time to really figure out what your needs are, working with architects, coming up with cost estimates, which is as we found out last year, we'd like to be, really simple to figure out, but sometimes there are surprises. We want all those things done, and then we can launch into, and this is the next step.
Thank you so much, Pete, especially for doing that on the cusp.
Sure.
I thought it was helpful for people to hear a little bit. By the way, friends, if you're feeling a little bashful about asking questions out loud, you can put them in the chat box too, directly to me, and no one else will know you asked them. And someone did ask a question, and I don't need to say who it is, and we can still get the question answered, which is great. So one person asked a question. Okay, the person wants to ask it out loud. Go for it.
Hi, everybody. Can you?
If you are in Jill's, yeah, Jill should mute hers then. Yeah.
I am muted.
Oh, okay. I don't know where the feedback was coming from. Sorry.
Yeah. You're not. Turn your volume down, babe. Okay. Hi, everyone. I know from talking to Pastor, the pastor had mentioned, I think when ownership's transferred, the legal costs, obviously, but I hear talk about inspections and all sorts of stuff. Is that just related to the sale of the land, or is that above and beyond with building on? I'm just trying to get a whole scope of all these extra things that were talked about.
Yeah. Let me start that, and then I'll maybe turn it over to
You can unmute.
Yeah. So, right, we want to do our due diligence to make sure that this wonderful gift of an additional building to serve God is a gift, right? And so, and that's why a fair amount of what those sort of that due diligence cost will be, that will be covered by that Attorney General $30,000 grant, but not quite all of it. So things like we'll likely have to pay for include the title insurance, which is to sort of, as I understand it, make sure that we properly do have title of the property once we do. There would need to be, looking for asbestos, basic environmental, phase 1 environmental assessment to make sure, there's no toxic barrels of whatever buried somewhere or something like that. And because we want to make sure that, when we do take ownership of the property, that it's going to be the sort of property that we need to, that we can do what we're hoping to do with. So that's where there will be some of that cost. I will say, and doesn't mean that it's not incredibly tight like always, because it is. But one thing that makes me feel a little more optimistic here is that we did have by far, and thanks to all of you, the best financial year that I've seen since I've been here, and that's not just because of receiving a PPP loan money. It's part of it, but it's not just that. We had a very significant surplus this past year, and that'll help a bit. Obviously, we have increased cost, especially this year with Pastor Jonathan on staff as well. So, it doesn't mean we can just spend gobs of money on everything, but it does feel like any additional costs for the pre-development work, the inspections, et cetera, will be under that $10,000 cap. And, and that's what the congregation will be authorizing us to spend if that's what we vote on max out, so it wouldn't, that's what we would be part of our voting in the annual meeting. I hope that helps a little bit. And if there's a follow-up, I'm happy to take that, or Peter, you have more thoughts on that, but.
I mean, really what you're doing with $10,000 is you are, like with any real estate transaction, you're, there's certain costs that go with that. If any of you have ever bought a home or whatever, this would be similar. I mean, I sold a home in Burlington, Vermont, and it turned out that the buyer required, before we could transfer the property to him, that we do a inspection to see if there was an oil tank under the property, and somebody had to pay for that. I think in that case, it was me, the seller, who had to pay for that cost. So, you know, there are just some costs that just go with transferring, selling property from one entity to another, regardless of whether you have this other pre-development money, which is in the offing. So if you can get as much of that covered as possible, that's great, you know, and that's where you kind of negotiate that out with the seller of the property and you, the buyer, you know, to be sure that that transfer is done well and that all parties are protected.
Yeah. So, and I don't know for sure, but so Jeff Heumann, who is our Synods lawyer as well, is the person sort of representing us at this stage of it. He's a really great guy. I just had a conversation with him today. He thinks that some of the cost, you know, might be even a little bit lower than what you know, who is our neighbor consultants put out once we get there. So we really do think that that $10,000 is a ceiling, and it might be significantly less.
I kind of view that as insurance to make sure that Messiah does not have a big bill to pay down the road.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely.
That's why we do this stuff. This is why when you buy a house, you know, you have to pay a little bit to be sure that what you're getting is not going to be a burden on you later on.
All right. So I'm seeing a question, and this is so we had a survey that at least a few people filled out, and I wish more had with questions for tonight. And this was the question, and I do not think that anything is set in stone. But the question was, I believe you had mentioned that the food pantry would be in the community center. Is that set in stone? I'm going to defer that to Pastor Jonathan, because he was part of the last conversation with our food pantry folks, and I was not. So Pastor Jonathan, hit it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So our short-term plans, again, a lot of this depends largely on when the actual transfer of the property does take place. The Reformed Church, the denomination that holds the property right now, is really limiting what we are able to do with it, because they're the ones who hold liability over it right now. Once the property is transferred to Messiah, we'll be able to do more with the property. While we don't have a specific date or means of how this is actually going to take place, the eventual hope and conversation would be that we'd be able to utilize the Trinity property as a kind of expanded food pantry location, given kind of the space in the parking lot and whatnot, and really being able to focus really the location with bus lines and things. Again, we don't have a specific timeline on that, exactly how that's going to look. It's going to start very small, right? Which, as was mentioned by Pete, initially kind of restarting the produce distribution that that Trinity has been offering, because that's something that doesn't cost us anything. But eventually, right, as we continue to develop and expand the former Trinity campus into really kind of a all-purpose community hub for a variety of needs, really, that's probably the direction that we'll be going, right, is to consolidate all the community pieces there. Again, what all those details look like, right, haven't been sorted out yet, but that is the direction that things would eventually be moving.
Yeah, at least from my perspective, there's no massive rush here. We need to figure out ways, all sorts of pros and cons, and then there's a lot that's not, finally decided. But that's, that is the direction that I mean, that's what's in our proposal to move forward. And I'm happy to answer any other follow-up questions from anyone on that. Or, I mean, frankly, we've gotten into a lot of money stuff, which is important. But, in terms of some of the mission stuff, there might be some even other ideas here of other things that people feel are really important that we might be doing in that space. And I'm happy to open that up for right here too.
One comment, Pastor, just so that the financial aspect is clear about this $10,000. That is not currently, as far as I know, included in the proposed budget for 2021. So it would be over and above that.
Correct. Yeah. So that's a question I have, is whether we maybe should, as a 1-year thing, as a placeholder so we can know, easy to tabulate what we have been spending on sort of the legal side of things, or if it should be, just, been pulled from another fund or, something like that. And I don't have a clear answer on that. And I would certainly defer to your and Christy's wisdom, big time on that.
Could I, Justin, just say one other thing? I just want to emphasize that, you have a vision and a footprint kind of what you hope is going to happen with your property. But just to be aware that, there will be a decision point down the line after you've done more due diligence on the property and you see what people are willing or not willing to do with it. And the congregation will, make decisions at that point, based on what's put in front of them. For instance, you might find that you'll get more return off your land if you adjust some of the mission things that you're going to do, you'd wanted to do, for, say, additional financial benefit, or not. But there'll be a point where you all get to discern that, but it'll be a much easier conversation if you've thought deeply about your mission first, which you have done.
And I hit too many buttons at once. And I think the one thing to add too about the mission side of things, right, is that it's really important to say whatever is going to be going on in this community center space, that might sound to you like, how are we going to do that? That we don't have that many volunteers or that much expertise or that much staff. And the answer is we probably don't. And that's why, part of what the figuring out of what that community center will look like is, one of the greatest things that I think we really invested a lot of time on doing over the last few years, and not just me, Judy and Joyce and Rich Becker and Rebecca Bliss and a number of others. We've developed a lot of relationships with other not-for-profits in the area, right?
Right.
Everything from the, with the Schenectady Foundation to obviously the Boys and Girls Club is next door. SCAP, right? There's a lot. SICM is very involving. I don't know, but it's entirely possible that sort of as what Pete said, that part of what that community center will look like is not just figuring out what we'll be doing ourselves there, but figuring out what we want to do and then finding the right partners to do it. And so that'll be kind of a next piece of this too. And some of that, right, can happen before the final development of the building too. And by the way, right, supporting the existing partners that have used that space for years, and like 12-step programs is another really, I think, central thing to what we've really committed on wanting to maintain doing. So that's just another thing that we do not know yet.
Just to say that there's a decision point later on where you get to weigh the pros and cons of whatever you want to do in light of the reality of who you're negotiating with.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, making the decision to move forward on purchasing the building is not the same thing as making the decision on what exactly is going into the building. And
That's correct.
what configuration is going into the building.
That's right. That's a point down the line.
All righty, we're on an hour and 18 minutes here. What other questions do people have that they want to lift up, at least publicly? You can also put it in the chat box. You want? Oh, I'm not seeing any. Going once, going twice. No. Well, I very much appreciate everyone's time tonight for some good questions, for some really good feedback. Reverend Peter Cook, Reverend Pete Roos, thank you for taking the time to join our community here as well, that we're trying to piece together and discern, all the while being in these darn little boxes and not in person, and it makes it that much harder. I do think, friends, that there's a lot of exciting possibilities here. I do believe that even though we don't know every single thing about how this community center will develop, that we have really moved in some really exciting directions, despite like the worst year in all our lives. And I have no doubt that however we decide to move forward, that success and that sense of mission and service to our community and to God will continue. So I really thank you all tonight. I don't know, Pastor Jonathan, any final thoughts before we close? Or do you want to close us out with prayer?
Yeah, I think I would just say, in closing too, that so I'm going to take off my pastor hat, right, and I'm going to put on my therapist hat here, my social worker hat. There are a lot of pieces, right, that are coming together in this. There's financial, legal, spiritual, community-based, people with all different, I'm going to use the word agendas. I think sometimes that has negative connotations. I don't mean it in that sense, but people coming from a lot of different places and spaces into this conversation. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's going to be some times along the way where this is going to be a little bumpy. Sometimes where some things might not quite line up just right. That doesn't mean that what we're doing isn't a good thing. We're going to take this slow. We're going to take this deliberately. We're going to be thoughtful. We're going to listen to people's feedback. So again, please keep bringing the feedback on to both Pastor Dustin and to myself. Really part of one of my jobs as your interim associate, right, is really to help facilitate this transition. So please give me the feedback and the questions as we continue to navigate this process. But I think it's important to just name that reality because, in many ways things have gone smoothly up until this point. But I think as we get closer to conversations around money, around legality, there's some things that could get a little, that could get, tense, when you talk about things like money and legality. We're going to be slow. We're going to be deliberate. We're going to listen to one another. We're going to always assume best intentions because we believe, right, in this work, that this work is going to be beneficial long after all of us are gone. The footprint and the change that we can make in the Rotterdam community can far exceed what any of us can do. So let's see. Yep. All right. Anything else, for us? I can close us in a prayer. So.
Guys
All
have
right.
just done a wonderful thing, and just to build on what Pete just said, he goes around, he talks to churches, and I trust his judgment in saying that not all churches, even most churches, know how to do this or have that mission focus which you have, and you're really to be commended for that.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. And for all your guidance on this too. I mean, we would not have gotten anywhere close to where we are without the good work of the Council of Churches and all your work. So.
It's our pleasure, our privilege.
All right, do you want me to close us, Pastor Dustin?
Please.
All right, let us pray. Creator God, who creates new things from the ashes. God, you have taken us on a journey that you are still walking with us on, one that is bringing new life into two faith communities as they continue to explore now together as one what it means to do as the prophet Micah commands us, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with you. And so as we go from this meeting back out into our lives, God, keep that at the forefront of our imagination. Let us continue to think of what it means to care for those on the margins, to expand your revolutionary and transformative love in our community. Be with us, O God, we pray. For it is in your name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a blessed night.
All right. Peace.